Marvin Gaye, let's say Marvin Gaye, you all love. Paul.
We keep mixing up who the guests are because it's like your family. You never remember your kid's name.
Peter, actually.
No, let's say all the brothers'
And where's
names
Mary?
first. Exactly. Peter, Paul, and Mary. Well, nice to see you.
Good to see you.
Welcome
This
back.
is Paul Draus,
morning in
who
Chicago.
Paul used to be the producer and co-host of this show when he was doing graduate work at Loyola here in the neighborhood. And he went off to a few places, but now he's in Detroit, teaching at the University of Michigan at Ypsilanti.
Dearborn.
Dearborn, my apologies.
Dearborn.
Well, it's just try to understand the geography of the whole world. Sometimes I mix up a city now and then.
Here and there.
You're forgiven.
Okay, Dearborn. That was what they used to do there? They built cars?
Yeah, they still build cars in Dearborn. Actually, the Ford F-150 is made in Dearborn at the River Rouge facility, which used to be one of the wonders of the world. That was when Henry Ford wanted to do everything required to make a car in one facility. So they would make the steel there. They would bring in the rubber. They did it all there. It's still there. I mean, it's a tremendous
museum too.
Well, the museum has a tour. The Henry Ford Museum has a bus that goes over to the Ford Rouge facility, which is still an active facility. But they still make vehicles.
Was there a history of labor strife there at River Rouge?
Oh yeah. There was the Battle of the Overpass is actually commemorated there. It was when Walter Reuther got knocked in the head by the Dearborn cops, I think, either that or it was Ford security guys. There was another march earlier than that in the 20s or 30s called the Hunger March, which took place a little bit downriver from the Rouge facility. But the Battle of the Overpass was the one that really led to the UAW being able to organize Ford, because Ford resisted the UAW, I think, for a longer period of time than did General Motors. But yeah, so it is commemorated in UAW Local 600, which is located which is the local for the Rouge River plant. Has been one of the most militant locals in the country. One of the most early on, one of the most integrated locals, and they've been a militant local. So yeah, the UAW, and actually now, of course, business unionism, the UAW and the Big Three, work hand in glove much of the time, although, of course, they had to take some beat-down concessions, I think.
Well, here we are in almost to 2014, and one of our beloved American cities is really under the gun. It's now in bankruptcy. There's a lot of legal challenges. Some of the unions and the pension people are challenging the city. We have an article today on the front of the Chicago Tribune talking about ruin porn. People going up to Detroit and taking pictures
I haven't seen that. You have that?
Taking pictures of. Let's hold it up.
Portraits of a city in decay.
Yeah,
It's you guys' version of the Al Capone tourist attraction in Chicago. Not porn.
Yeah, no, I mean, I've seen this so many times now. Actually, Carla, my wife, my lovely wife, who's over there in the corner, and my sister. I do want to send a shout out to my sister and her new fiance.
And you got your kids here. Okay,
yes.
We're having a great time.
I mean, he's not new, but he's newly a fiance, so he's over there. But we were in Paris in November, and we walked past the Canadian consulate. Had an exhibit of photographs of Detroit. The same kind of stuff.
Really?
And so it's like all over the place. I was actually looking on the internet last night, and PBS had done a series, and they usually have titles like this. It was called Desolate Detroit, Portrait of a City in Despair or something like that. So yeah, I mean, we're kind of used to that, and it's kind of a pet peeve for people in Detroit, the ruin porn. On the other hand, it's unavoidable when you're going to the city and you're seeing it for the first time. It's unavoidable. The power of that imagery it kind of hits you right in the face. So.
Well, I was just up there about a month ago, and I hung out with you a little bit. I was chasing Twin Peaks, my kid's band, around, and I spent the next morning with another son, David, driving around Detroit looking at the lawns, there was grass, sometimes it was high, and all these boarded up buildings and graffiti, And, it was beautiful in a strange kind of a way. It was also pretty sad, I mean, Detroit was a place that we used to visit. At Wayne State, there was political activism. You had John Sinclair and the White Panther Party coming out of there. You had real activists in the United Auto Workers. And all of a sudden, Detroit lost population.
It wasn't all of a sudden.
No, actually, it started around the middle of the 20th century, actually.
Yeah, exactly.
So, I mean, if you go back and you look at it, so, I mean, you had the urban insurrection of 1967, which was kind of a prelude to a lot of what came after. Detroit, I think, at that time was the biggest urban insurrection ever, although, it came a few years after Watts.
Insurrection, rebellion, some people say riot.
Riot, yeah, 1967, which was actually really more of it's often called a race riot, but it was really more of a police riot because it was largely African-American residents in conflict with largely white police officers and later the U.S. military who were the National Guard were brought to the city. But so a lot of people date 1967 as a date when the city's population decline began. But if you look at the history, it's clear that the population started to decline around the end of World War II, around 1950. And it was with the building up of the suburbs, and FHA loans were made available to a lot of white would-be homeowners to build homes in the suburbs. They weren't made available to African Americans at that time, and that was, in fact, a deliberate policy. And the building of highways in the mid-20th century
broke up
enabled the suburbanization and the suburban sprawl, which still characterizes Detroit. So you really had the population decline beginning then, and 67 was as much a result of the kind of the concentration of black poverty in the city and with white flight, and then the occupying, sort of the perception of the police as an occupying army in those communities. But since 1967, of course, it accelerated, and so that's continued, and it's still continuing today. And now it's actually mainly African Americans are leaving the city of Detroit. I don't know what the number is every day. There's, if it's 100 people, this is of course a statistical, because nobody's sitting there counting them as they leave. But something like on the order of 100 people a day or something like that are leaving the city of Detroit.
Well, would you say that? I mean, once again, it seems to me that race is the key factor. Race and the economics around race is the key factor for the demise of Detroit, as much as there is demise. That we have,
Well, it's not only. It's also, I think, a key factor in this, in why it's taken as long as it has for Detroit to be, rebuilt, because I think the racial division there has been so stark. So, I mean, you actually are seeing a rebuilding now of Detroit in the central core of Detroit and in certain neighborhoods in Detroit, but you're actually seeing an influx of money, an influx of new residents. A lot of them are sort of young, white, college-educated, we call them hipsters. I know, you have such a...
We know about hipsters.
And actually, in many ways, they're a welcome. They bring a lot of energy. There's a lot of creativity in the city, and there's a lot of creativity going on in the neighborhoods of the city of Detroit. In fact, as a sociologist in Detroit, I've just resigned myself to not really knowing what the answer is to anything, and just going out and just.
That's why we brought you on the show.
And just trying to learn from what people are doing. And I'm always amazed in Detroit. There's visionaries like everywhere I go. I mean, people that are working on really visionary ideas and projects and stuff, all throughout different neighborhoods and corners of the city. So for me, it's just a constant learning experience. I'm just kind of like this was actually a line from a Goethe poem, I think, like a mole in the murk, seeking my way, trying to understand what's happening there, because I think it's something that's really important that's happening there. But I've also reflected on why it's taken so long for so-called gentrification to happen in Detroit, with the kind of buildings that are there, and I think that a lot of that has to do with race too. I mean, I think the reason why the money hasn't come in sooner, and we just elected a white mayor. For the first time since 1974.
And he's a businessman.
No, he's not. He's an old school politician. He's a machine politician. Mike Duggan. He came up in the Wayne County.
Good Irish lad.
Yeah. And he was recently though head of the DMC, the Detroit Medical Center, and so that was sort of what appealed to it. And the fact is that he ran as a write-in candidate because one of the other candidates in the primary challenged his
residency.
Challenged his residency because, in fact, he did what a lot of politicians. In fact, the previous mayor had done the same thing, which was Mayor Dave Bing, who was a businessman, African American businessman, who also didn't live in the city until he decided he was going to run for mayor, and then moved his residence. So I mean, he certainly wasn't the first guy to have done that. So he was challenged, and it was found that he hadn't filed his paper. There was some technicality, and he was taken off the ballot.
He won
as a write-in candidate, and of course.
That's really something. I mean,
yeah, and this is largely African Americans voters that are voting for him, but they're voting for him because of, I think, because of what he did or what he supposedly has done with the Detroit Medical Center and turning it around. It was a struggling, failing institution, and he portrayed himself as a kind of a turnaround expert.
In preparation for this, Michael kept sending me things that may have come from you originally.
Not all of them.
But the Detroit Free Press article that I was reading this morning that is the best by Nathan Bomey and John Gallagher of the Free Press, Detroit Free Press. Their analysis, basically shows failed leadership vis-a-vis the failure of.
But they let Coleman Young off the hook.
All the way going back to the 50s, which of course does predate Coleman Young and makes it so that both white guys and black guys were in charge of things falling apart.
Yeah.
But, the whole question, which we started when we talked to Tom early on about income discrepancy and, the inequality across the board in the U.S., which to me is one of the greatest fears challenging democracy going forward, is, the corporate people who get to put all kind of money into, politics, and then the lack of support for a middle class or even a conversation, a national conversation. And Detroit seems like a sort of a stark picture, except for the fact that you say the creativity that you see everywhere.
Yeah.
We have seen it as well. The Bog Center, we've had people from that. I remember the Rebuild Detroit folks that I ran into. I'm talking 20 years ago at the Bioregional Conference for the Great Lakes Bioregion. So that clearly there are small groups of people working to build a sustainable thing there in the community.
Speaking of which, I saw a great thing on Rachel Maddow the other night where I think these people, was like guerrilla theater. They set off a little rocket, or they ignited a thing trying to protect the Public Art Museum, which is up for grabs, I guess, with the bankruptcy proceedings.
Yeah.
And they said, "Don't touch our art" or something. They set this thing on fire. Yeah. Tell us a little bit about that.
Well, okay, so the DIA, we call it the Detroit Institute of Arts, is a great museum. It's probably one of the, it's up there with the Art Institute. It's a beautiful, it was recently actually renovated. It's got a great collection. It's got the historic Diego Rivera mural, which was painted there on 4 walls, and it's called the Rivera Court now.
Wow.
It's incredibly well preserved, and it's a beautiful, and it's recognized regionally as a resource. In fact, this is something that's truly remarkable in a place like Detroit, in a region like Detroit, which is so racially fragmented and divided, that 3 counties, that Wayne County, which is where Detroit is and where we are in Dearborn, Oakland County, which is a very, very wealthy county just north of Detroit, and then Macomb County, which is just to the east, all came together and decided, residents of those 3 counties decided to tax themselves. It was a referendum in order to support the DIA, to be able to stabilize the DIA so it wouldn't have to make stark decisions about whether or not to close. So there's actually is a regional commitment to the Detroit Institute of Arts. Now, the issue with the art being sold came up in the bankruptcy because the city of Detroit, even though the city of Detroit no longer controls or runs the museum, technically owns the art, because a lot of the art was purchased actually by the city when the city was flush with cash. This was back in the days of the auto, the boom days of the auto industry in the early 20th century. So a lot of the great art was purchased by the city of Detroit and is still technically owned by the city of Detroit. So when the city went into bankruptcy or filed for bankruptcy, the creditors we're looking. They want to get their money out of the city because they're looking at taking as they say in economic circles, taking a haircut on the money that they had lent to the city. So the DIA, there was a big debate about the DIA art being put on the table, and technically it is. Actually, Christie's came in and evaluated the art, and originally the people were saying that there's a couple $1 billion worth of art there, but they actually came back with a much lower figure, something along the line.
Of course they
around
did.
$500 million. But I think that this is my perspective on it. I think the DIA will be preserved because here's going back to the race thing. Here's just a simple observation. White people with money care about art. And they're going to find a way. The philanthropic and foundation communities are going to find a way to make a deal with the emergency manager to preserve the DIA and the art. Now, the fact is that Detroit is being robbed every day by its physical infrastructure is being broken down and sold off on a daily basis by people inside the city itself. And this is not, you can't really blame those people. They're adapting and surviving. But the fact is that we have a scrapping industry in Detroit that is every day is sending out the raw materials and and metals and actually shipping them across the pond to China so they can build their new cities. So we have an ongoing and part of the reason why you see those photographs that you see is because this infrastructure is being constantly taken apart. So, but you don't see the kind of national media attention or sympathy around that issue that you do around the DIA and the art. I think the DIA issue has gotten a lot of attention both locally and nationally and internationally because it strikes. It's a good story.
Yeah, right.
And I think that in the end the DIA will be preserved because it's pretty clear that if you take apart the museum, you're not only even if you get the maximum amount of money and monetize the collection, the damage that's done to the city in terms of its reputation, in terms of its ability to rebuild is going to be more than what you would get.
Well, this is an ongoing story, and we're going to have you back with updates. But let me ask you as our final question of this segment, what your sense is of the future of this governor and the legislature, and any chance that there'll be any reprieve from a kind of a conservative drift up in Michigan?
Well, you know what? I'm not as down on the governor because the fact is that the legislature is a piece of work. There's no doubt about it. We have a backwards legislature, and some
they're the ones that separated off Benton Harbor and St. Joseph's, or
well,
that's a whole nother thing.
Well, the fact is that a lot of those cities were financially, in need of now the question of whether or not emergency managers actually do anything about that is another question. But I think the governor, I think, is fairly sincere in wanting to do something about Detroit and to build up Detroit. Now, his ideas about how that should be done might be very different from those of people in Detroit. I don't know who's on the horizon in terms of a possible Democratic alternative to the governor, although there is a guy that's running that I think it would be a pretty good choice. I don't know what his chances are of winning, but I think, the thing to watch in Detroit, in the city of Detroit, is what's going on at the grassroots level. We have council by district for the first time now in over 50 years. We have a brand new city council. Actually, the first Latina woman ever elected to the city council in Detroit was elected in this last election. We have a new mayor. You have the restructuring of the city. There's a lot going on. 2014 is going to be a very, very interesting year to watch what emerges in the city of Detroit. So, I'm excited about it. For better or for worse, there's going to be a lot to see and a lot to learn from. But I'm hopeful about the city of Detroit is going to come back. The question is in what form.
Paul Draus.
There's a great book out called Ready for a Brand New Beat by Mark Kurlansky, who was a guest on the show, wrote Salt and Cod. And it's a wonderful book about Motown and the recording institution. And I recommend it highly. Paul, it's always great to see you. We love it when you're back in Chicago. You are listening to Live from the Heartland
Let's hear
show.
for Paul Draus.
Paul Draus, and we're going to be right back. We're going to be right back with a little bit of music. We're going to have
Bill Howling, Mad Perry,
and Shy Perry. They'll be coming right up. We'll be right back. And give us a minute, and we'll be here.
Thanks, guys.